The cruise ship glided through the calm waters of the Pacific, its hull slicing through the glassy surface with ease. The horizon stretched endlessly, a seamless blend of ocean and sky, broken only by the occasional ripple of distant waves. For the passengers, it was paradise, an escape from the chaos of the world. But for Ethan, a young crew member, the vast emptiness of the sea was anything but serene. He leaned against the ship's railing, staring into the distance. The rhythmic hum of the engines and the faint murmur of voices from the deck should have been comforting, but a gnawing sense of unease clung to him. He'd always feared the sea, ever since he was a child. The open water, with its infinite depths and unseen dangers, felt like a living entity, watching, waiting. Ethan clenched his fists, forcing himself to breathe deeply. He had taken this job to conquer his fear, to prove to himself that the ocean held no power over him. Yet, every time he looked out at the vast expanse, a cold dread crept up his spine. Tonight was no different. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in hues of deep orange and purple. As darkness fell, the sea seemed to grow even larger, its depths more unknowable. Ethan's thoughts were interrupted by a crackle over the ship's radio. The lookout had spotted something, a small light bobbing in the distance. A lifeboat, the captain announced after a moment of silence. "Turn us toward it." The crew sprang into action, but Ethan remained rooted to the spot, his unease deepening. Alone in the vast emptiness of the ocean, a single lifeboat drifted toward them like a ghost. The crew worked quickly, lowering a smaller boat to retrieve the lifeboat's lone occupant. Ethan stood at the railing, watching as the figure was hoisted aboard. The man appeared gaunt, his clothes ragged and soaked. Despite his condition, he carried himself with an eerie calm, his gaze fixed ahead as if he were oblivious to his surroundings. The captain stepped forward, his face a mask of concern. "What happened out there?" The man's voice was quiet, almost mechanical. "Storm. The ship went down." His words were clipped, devoid of emotion. He offered no further explanation, and no questions seemed to pry more from him. Ethan shivered, though the night was warm. Something about the man felt off. His eyes were pale, almost translucent, and they lacked the spark of someone who had just been rescued from death. Instead, they seemed ancient, as though they had seen far more than anyone should. The captain nodded, directing the man to an empty cabin. "We'll get you warm and fed. Rest now. You're safe here." The man offered a slight nod and walked silently down the hall, his wet footsteps echoing against the steel floors. Ethan found himself unable to look away until the man disappeared from sight. A cold unease settled in his stomach. "Ethan," the captain said, snapping him back to reality. "Get back to your duties." Ethan nodded but couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The sea had given them a passenger, but Ethan couldn't help but wonder what it had taken in return. The following days passed in a blur of routine, yet the atmosphere aboard the ship felt different. It started subtly. The hum of the ship's engine seemed irregular. Lights flickered in the lower decks, and the radio often crackled with static. Passengers whispered about strange noises at night, footsteps, soft murmurs, and knocks at their doors. The rescued man, however, kept to himself, rarely seen outside his cabin. Ethan's unease grew. Each time he passed the passenger's cabin, a chill ran down his spine. The man's presence seemed to warp the air around him. Ethan began to notice something else. Electronics failed whenever the man was near. The ship's navigation systems briefly went haywire during his brief appearances on deck, forcing the crew to recalibrate instruments. One evening, Ethan was tasked with delivering food to the man's cabin. He knocked, but there was no response. When he finally entered, he found the untouched meals from previous days stacked neatly on the desk. The man sat by the window, staring out at the dark ocean. His reflection in the glass seemed wrong, distorted, as though the sea behind him was pulling at his image. "You haven't eaten," Ethan said, trying to sound casual, though his heart raced. The man didn't turn. "I don't need to," he replied, his voice soft but chilling. It's not hunger that keeps me alive. Ethan backed out of the cabin, his hands trembling. That night, he barely slept. His dreams were filled with drowning, endless waves dragging him into darkness. He woke gasping, his clothes drenched in sweat. But he wasn't the only one. The ship's infirmary filled with crew members complaining of similar nightmares, all eerily specific. The sea had begun whispering to them, and Ethan feared it was speaking through the passenger. The ship was eerily quiet in the early hours of the morning. Ethan, plagued by restlessness, found himself wandering the deck. The air was still, and the water below reflected the night sky like a vast, unbroken mirror. As he rounded a corner, he froze. The passenger stood at the edge of the railing, his back to Ethan, his head tilted upward, and his lips moved, though no sound escaped. Ethan stepped closer, careful not to make a noise. The man seemed lost in some ritual, murmuring in a language Ethan couldn't recognize. The ocean responded. Waves began to churn violently, slamming against the ship's hull. A sudden gust of wind howled across the deck, whipping at Ethan's clothes. He stumbled back, but the passenger remained unmoved, as if the storm bent around him. "Hey!" Ethan shouted over the growing roar of the wind. The man didn't turn, didn't flinch. The commotion drew other crew members. By the time the captain arrived, the storm had subsided as quickly as it had come. The passenger stepped away from the railing and walked calmly past the gathered crew, his face as impassive as ever. The captain tried to question him, but the man said nothing. Later that day, a crew member went missing. His belongings were still in his cabin, but there was no sign of him on board. Search efforts yielded nothing. Whispers of superstition spread among the crew, but no one could explain the man's disappearance. Ethan knew better. He had seen the passenger speaking to the sea, and now the ocean had claimed someone in return. Ethan's curiosity turned into obsession. He needed answers. Late at night, he crept into the ship's archive room, sifting through old logs and records. Most were mundane entries about past voyages, but one log, dated over 40 years ago, caught his eye. The entries described another ship that had encountered a lone survivor in the middle of the ocean. The captain of that vessel had taken the man aboard, only for strange occurrences to follow: disappearances, inexplicable malfunctions, and an overwhelming sense of dread among the crew. The final entry was chilling. The sea demands its due. We cannot escape it. The passenger is its vessel. Ethan's hands trembled as he closed the log. He felt the weight of the truth pressing down on him. The passenger wasn't a survivor. He was a harbinger, an emissary of something ancient and malevolent. The ocean wasn't just vast, it was alive, and it had a will of its own. Ethan rushed to the captain, but his warnings were dismissed as paranoia. Desperate, Ethan confided in the ship's engineer, a man named Morales. Together, they reviewed the ship's systems and discovered patterns. Every malfunction coincided with the passenger's movements. Morales was skeptical, but agreed something was deeply wrong. As they talked, the ship's alarm blared. Another crew member had vanished, leaving behind only the faint sound of water dripping in their cabin. Morales's face paled. "You're right," he muttered. "But what do we do?" Ethan didn't have an answer. The passenger's presence meant their fate was sealed, unless they could stop him. Ethan knew the passenger had to be confronted, but the prospect terrified him. The ocean had chosen this man as its vessel, and Ethan feared what confronting him might unleash. Still, with Morales at his side, he gathered the courage to act. They found the passenger on the top deck, gazing out at the horizon. The sea was calm, but the sky was darkening rapidly. Ethan stepped forward, his voice steady despite his fear. "We know what you are." The passenger turned slowly, his pale eyes meeting Ethan's. "Do you?" he said, his lips curling into a faint smile. "You've brought this ship to ruin," Ethan said. "You're tied to the sea, and it's using you to destroy us." The passenger took a step closer. "The sea takes what it's owed. You cannot stop it." A sudden blast of wind nearly knocked them off their feet. The calm sea erupted into chaos as waves crashed violently against the ship. Morales grabbed Ethan's arm. "We have to do something now." In a desperate move, Ethan lunged at the passenger, forcing him toward the railing. The man didn't resist as Ethan shoved him overboard. He disappeared beneath the waves without a sound. The storm ceased immediately. The sea returned to its eerie calm. But Ethan felt no relief. He had confronted the passenger, but something told him this was far from over. The following morning, the crew gathered to assess the damage. The ship was battered but still seaworthy. The passengers, shaken by the storm, spoke of strange dreams, but seemed unaware of the true horror they had narrowly escaped. Ethan stood on the deck, watching the horizon as the ship neared its destination. The sense of relief among the crew was palpable, but Ethan couldn't shake the lingering dread that clung to him. His thoughts were interrupted by Morales, who handed him the new passenger manifest. Ethan's blood ran cold as he scanned the list. At the bottom was a name he didn't recognize, but the description matched the man he had thrown overboard. It was as if he had returned, or perhaps he had never truly left. Morales frowned. Something wrong? Ethan forced a weak smile. No, just tired. He knew better. The ocean's curse wasn't broken. It would find another way, another vessel. As the ship docked, Ethan vowed never to set foot on the sea again. But deep down, he knew the ocean's pull was eternal, and it would come for him, sooner or later. The narrow road wound through dense forests and jagged cliffs, eventually giving way to the small fishing village that clung to the rocky shoreline. The air was thick with the scent of salt and seaweed, and the distant crash of waves echoed through the stillness. Clara's car came to a stop at the village's edge, where time seemed to stand still. The familiar sight of weathered cottages and fishing boats bobbing in the harbor stirred a mix of nostalgia and unease within her. It had been over a decade since Clara left this place, determined never to return. Yet here she was, drawn back by a letter from her estranged grandmother, the last living member of her family. The letter was cryptic, hinting at unfinished business and warning of dark times ahead. As Clara stepped out of the car, the villagers turned to look. Their faces were worn by years of hard labor and harsh weather, their eyes filled with suspicion and a hint of fear. Whispers followed her as she made her way through the narrow streets, their voices low but unmistakable. She came back, someone muttered. She shouldn't have, another replied. Clara ignored them, focusing on the ocean ahead. The water was a deep, restless blue, reflecting the overcast sky. It stretched endlessly, a constant reminder of the village's lifeblood and its curse. As much as she tried to rationalize her return, something about the sea felt different now, heavier, more alive. Her grandmother's house stood on a small hill overlooking the village, its windows dark and uninviting. Clara took a deep breath and began the climb, her unease growing with every step. The first night back in the village was eerily quiet. Clara sat in her grandmother's living room, the crackling of the fire the only sound. The house was cold, the damp sea air seeping through the old wooden walls. As she prepared for bed, a sense of unease settled over her. She dismissed it as nerves. It had been years since she'd slept here. In the dead of night, Clara awoke suddenly. The room was dark, but something had stirred her from sleep. She lay still, listening. At first, all she could hear was the rhythmic crash of waves. But then she heard it, a faint whisper. At first, she thought it was the wind, but the sound grew clearer. The whisper seemed to be calling her name, carried on the breeze that swept through the open window. She bolted upright, heart pounding. "Who's there?" she called out, but only silence answered. Determined to prove it was nothing, she threw on a coat and stepped outside. The village was cloaked in darkness, the ocean glinting faintly under the moonlight. She followed the whispers to the cliffside, where the sound grew louder, swirling around her. The voice was unmistakable now. Clara. Panic seized her, and she stumbled back, nearly losing her footing. She ran back to the house, slamming the door behind her. Sleep was impossible after that. The next morning, she ventured into the village. Whispers followed her again, but this time from the people. She overheard two elderly men speaking in hushed tones. "The sea's been speaking again," one muttered. "It's starting," the other replied darkly. Clara confronted them, but they fell silent, their eyes shifting uneasily. One of them finally warned her, "Stay away from the sea at night." Clara couldn't shake the whispers. Every night, they returned, stronger, more insistent. During the day, the villagers avoided her gaze, their silence more telling than any words. Determined to understand what was happening, Clara visited the village's small archive, tucked away in an old church. The archive was dusty and poorly lit, filled with brittle papers and water-stained journals. Clara combed through records of births, deaths, and ship logs, hoping for answers. Hours passed before she found what she was looking for, a collection of old letters and a weathered journal belonging to one of the village's founders. The journal detailed a time of conflict when the first settlers arrived. They had struck a deal with the native people who lived along the coast, but greed drove the settlers to betray them. The natives, desperate to protect their land, placed a curse on the village. According to the journal, the curse was tied to the sea. The ocean would forever whisper the names of the descendants, reminding them of their ancestors' sins. Clara's hands trembled as she read. Her family name appeared multiple times, heavily implicated in the betrayal. The whispers weren't random. They were calling to her specifically. She shared her findings with a local elder, a woman named Agnes, who had lived in the village her entire life. Agnes confirmed Clara's worst fears. "The whispers are the voices of the wronged," she said. "They call out for justice, and they won't stop until the debt is paid." Clara asked what the whispers wanted. Agnes shook her head. "Only the sea knows. But if they're growing louder, it means the time for reckoning is near." Clara left the church feeling the weight of her family's sins. She realized the whispers weren't just a warning. They were a summons. That night, Clara's sleep was filled with strange and vivid dreams. She found herself submerged in icy water, the darkness pressing in on all sides. Ghostly figures surrounded her, their faces pale and eyes hollow. They whispered in unison, their voices rising in a haunting chorus. "Bring us peace, or face the tide." Clara awoke gasping, her heart racing. She couldn't ignore the message any longer. The whispers weren't just voices. They were the cries of the dead, demanding retribution. The next morning, she returned to Agnes, desperate for guidance. Agnes led her to a hidden cave beneath the cliffs, accessible only during low tide. Inside, the walls were covered in ancient carvings, depicting scenes of betrayal, death, and the wrath of the sea. At the center of the cave stood a stone altar, worn smooth by centuries of salt and water. Agnes explained that the altar was the key to breaking the curse. "The spirits demand a ritual," she said. "Only a descendant of the betrayers can perform it. That's why they've been calling you." Clara felt a chill run down her spine. She asked what the ritual entailed, but Agnes hesitated. "It's a sacrifice," she said finally. "Not of blood, but of spirit. You must offer yourself as a bridge between the living and the dead." Clara's mind raced. She had always prided herself on her rationality, but the evidence was undeniable. The curse was real, and the whispers wouldn't stop until justice was served. "Will it end the whispers?" Clara asked. Agnes's gaze was heavy. "It will bring peace, but the ocean never forgets. The village will survive, but its fate will always be tied to the sea." Clara knew what she had to do. The ritual was her only chance to save the village and herself. The day of the ritual arrived, and the village was on edge. Dark clouds gathered over the ocean, the air thick with electricity. The whispers were no longer confined to the night. They echoed through the streets, growing louder and more frantic with each passing hour. Clara spent the day preparing, guided by Agnes. She gathered the necessary items, a ceremonial dagger, offerings of salt and herbs, and a lantern to light her way in the cave. As she worked, the villagers watched from a distance, their faces a mix of fear and hope. Not everyone supported her efforts. A group of younger villagers confronted her as she made her way to the cliffs. "You're making things worse," one shouted. "The sea doesn't want rituals. It wants to take us all." Clara stood her ground, her voice steady despite the storm brewing within her. If I do nothing, the whispers will consume us. The group reluctantly backed down, but their distrust lingered. Clara pressed on, the weight of the village's fate on her shoulders. As she approached the cave, the storm unleashed its fury. Rain lashed against the cliffs, and waves crashed violently against the rocks. The wind howled, carrying the voices of the dead, now a deafening roar. At the cave's entrance, Agnes handed Clara the lantern. "The spirits will test you," she warned. "Stay strong." Clara nodded, her resolve firm. She entered the cave, the whispers guiding her deeper into the darkness. Inside the cave, the storm's fury was muffled, but the whispers were deafening. The lantern's light flickered against the damp walls, casting eerie shadows. Clara approached the altar, her heart pounding. She placed the offerings and raised the ceremonial dagger, reciting the incantations Agnes had taught her. The air grew colder, and the ocean surged into the cave, flooding the floor. The spirits began to materialize, their forms shimmering like water. They surrounded Clara, their faces filled with anguish and fury. One spirit, a woman with hollow eyes, stepped forward. "You carry the blood of the betrayers," she said, her voice echoing. "Why should we trust you to right their wrongs?" Clara met her gaze, her voice steady despite her fear. "I cannot change the past, but I offer myself to bridge the divide. Let this village atone through me." The spirits whispered among themselves, their voices blending into a cacophony. The storm outside intensified, the cave trembling with the force of the waves. Clara held her ground, even as the water rose around her. The lead spirit finally nodded. "Very well," she said. "But know this, the ocean will always watch. Your debt is paid, but the tide will remember." The spirits surged toward Clara, passing through her in a wave of cold energy. She cried out as their memories and pain flooded her mind. The storm reached its peak, then suddenly stopped. The cave fell silent, the water receding. Clara collapsed, exhausted but alive. The spirits were gone, their whispers replaced by the gentle lapping of waves. She had succeeded. When Clara emerged from the cave, the village was still standing. The storm had passed, leaving behind a quiet, eerie calm. The villagers gathered around her, their expressions a mix of relief and awe. Agnes approached, her eyes filled with pride. "You did it," she said softly. "The spirits are at peace." Clara nodded, though her body felt heavy with the weight of what she had experienced. She knew the village was safe for now, but the ocean's presence was more tangible than ever, a constant reminder of the past. In the days that followed, the village began to rebuild. The whispers had stopped, and life returned to a semblance of normalcy. Yet Clara knew the peace was fragile. The ocean would never truly forget, and neither would she. Standing at the cliff's edge one evening, Clara gazed out at the endless sea. The wind was calm, the waves gentle, but she could still feel its power. She had become a part of its story, a guardian of its secrets. Clara took a deep breath, the salty air filling her lungs. She had returned to the village as an outsider, but now she was its protector. The ocean's whispers may have faded, but its presence would always linger. And so would Clara, watching and waiting for the day the sea called again. The Nautilus deep hummed as it began its slow descent into the uncharted trench. Inside the state-of-the-art submarine, the air was filled with quiet anticipation. The control room's dim lights cast a faint glow on the faces of the crew, their expressions a mix of excitement and unease. Dr. Elena Reyes, seated near the observation window, watched as the last traces of sunlight faded, giving way to the endless darkness of the deep ocean. For Elena, this mission was the culmination of years of work. A marine archaeologist with a passion for uncovering lost histories, she had dreamed of exploring the mysteries of the abyss. This trench, deeper than any previously explored, held the promise of discoveries that could rewrite history. Yet, as the submarine descended, she couldn't shake a lingering sense of foreboding. Captain Mitchell, a grizzled man with decades of experience, stood at the helm, his steady voice issuing commands. "We're entering uncharted territory. Eyes on all systems," he said. The crew nodded, their hands busy at the controls. Despite the advanced technology, the pressure of the deep was a constant, looming threat. Outside, the world grew darker, illuminated only by the Nautilus Deep's exterior lights. Strange, bioluminescent creatures flickered in the distance, their glowing forms briefly visible before vanishing into the void. Elena marveled at their beauty, but the darkness beyond them seemed to stretch endlessly, oppressive and absolute. "We're nearing 5,000 meters, the sonar operator announced. Elena leaned closer to the window, her excitement building. She had no idea what awaited them at the bottom, but she was ready to face it. The submarine continued its descent, the crew unaware that something ancient and restless was watching from the depths. The submarine continued its descent, the hum of its engines a constant reminder of how far they had ventured from the surface. The crew monitored their instruments closely, alert for anything unusual. The sonar operator suddenly stiffened. "Captain, there's something massive down there," he said, his voice tight. "Approximately 200 meters below us." Captain Mitchell leaned over the console, studying the readout. "It's not natural," he muttered. "Hold this depth. Let's take a look." The external floodlights illuminated the dark water, slowly revealing a colossal structure. At first, it appeared to be a jagged cliff, but as they drew closer, the shapes became unmistakable. Towering stone spires, symmetrical columns, and vast plazas. It was a city, long buried in the ocean's abyss. The crew stared in awe. "It's impossible," whispered Elena, her breath fogging the glass of the observation window. The ruins stretched far beyond what their lights could reach. Massive statues stood sentinel, their features eroded by centuries underwater. They resembled humanoid figures with elongated limbs and intricate carvings of tentacles encircling their forms. "We're looking at a lost civilization," Elena said, her voice trembling with excitement. "This could be the discovery of the century." The captain wasn't as enthused. "We need to tread carefully," he said. "There's no telling what's down here." They deployed drones to capture footage of the ruins. The images came back in stark detail. Ancient walls covered in symbols, pathways leading to grand temples, and a central structure that seemed to pulse faintly under the lights. As the drones ventured deeper into the city, Elena felt a strange unease. The beauty of the ruins was undeniable, but something about the symmetry and silence of the place felt profoundly wrong. The drones navigated the narrow streets of the sunken city, their cameras transmitting haunting images back to the submarine. The crew was captivated, watching as the drones passed through grand archways and beneath towering statues. But then, without warning, one of the drones stuttered, its signal flickering. "What's happening?" Captain Mitchell barked. "Signal interference," the technician replied. "I'm trying to re-establish the feed." The screen flickered back on, but now there was something new, a faint audio feed accompanying the video. At first, it sounded like static, but then the noise began to coalesce into whispers, faint and disjointed. "Do you hear that?" Elena asked, leaning closer to the speakers. The whispers were faint but unmistakable. They seemed to speak in an ancient language, but occasionally, a word in English would break through. "Help join us below." The crew exchanged uneasy glances. "Could be a malfunction," the technician suggested weakly, though his hands trembled on the controls. As they listened, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Then, one of the crew members, a young engineer named Patel, gasped. "It's saying my name," he whispered. "I swear I just heard it say my name." Captain Mitchell ordered the drones recalled, but as they began their return, the whispers didn't cease. Instead, they seemed to bleed through the submarine's comm system, filling the control room with their eerie chorus. Later that night, Elena awoke from a restless sleep, her dreams filled with visions of the city as it once was alive, teeming with inhabitants who now wandered its ruins as shadows. She could still hear the whispers, even though the comms were silent. They were no longer just sounds. They were in her mind. Unable to sleep, Elena returned to the control room, where the drone footage played on a loop. She studied the ancient symbols carved into the city's walls, noting their repeated patterns and intricate designs. Each symbol seemed to flow into the next, creating a language both beautiful and unsettling. "Elena, you're up early," said Martinez, the submarine's linguist, as he joined her. "Or did you ever sleep?" "Not much," she admitted. "These symbols, they're familiar. I've seen similar carvings in ruins near coastal sites, but never this advanced." Together, they began decoding the symbols. Martinez pointed out recurring motifs, depictions of a massive sea deity surrounded by worshippers. The symbols told a fragmented story of a civilization that had thrived in harmony with the ocean until their ambition drove them to seek eternal life. "They performed a ritual," Elena murmured, tracing her finger over the carvings. "They bound themselves to the sea, but something went horribly wrong." Martinez nodded. "Their immortality came at a cost. They became trapped between life and death, their souls bound to the city." The whispers, now faintly audible through the submarine's hull, seemed to affirm their findings. The spirits of the city's inhabitants were still here, trapped in an endless cycle of torment, and they were reaching out to anyone who could hear them. "They want us to join them," Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's what the whispers are. They're calling us to become part of their eternal prison." Captain Mitchell, who had been silently listening, spoke up. "If that's true, then we're in more danger than we realized. We need to find a way to stop this before it consumes us." The whispers became an almost constant presence, their volume fluctuating as if responding to the crew's fears. By the next day, the strain was evident. Patel had isolated himself, refusing to leave his bunk. "They won't stop calling me," he muttered when Elena tried to check on him. At the same time, tensions between the crew reached a breaking point. Arguments flared over minor tasks, and suspicion ran rampant. Some accused others of being influenced by the whispers, while others claimed to see shadowy figures lurking at the edges of the submarine's lights. During a routine systems check, one of the engineers attempted to open the outer hatch, claiming he needed to answer the call. He was restrained just in time, but the incident left everyone shaken. "We're losing control," Captain Mitchell admitted to Elena in private. "If this keeps up, we won't make it out of here alive." Elena knew he was right. The city's influence was growing stronger, feeding on their fears and vulnerabilities. She spent hours poring over the symbols and texts, searching for a solution. There had to be a way to break the connection. "We need to perform a ritual of our own," she concluded, "one that can sever the link between us and the city." The captain was hesitant but agreed. It was their only chance. The crew gathered in the submarine's cramped observation room, their faces pale and eyes hollow. The whispers were louder than ever, a relentless tide of voices urging them to join the city below. Elena stood at the center, her notes spread out before her. "We have one chance," she said, her voice steady. "The ritual requires focus and cooperation. We need to show the spirits that we won't succumb to their curse." The crew reluctantly followed her lead, arranging the necessary items, pieces of deep-sea artifacts they had collected, arranged in a pattern matching the city's symbols. Elena began the incantation, her voice cutting through the cacophony of whispers. As the ritual progressed, the submarine trembled. Outside, the city seemed to pulse with life, and ghostly forms began to materialize in the water. They pressed against the submarine's windows, their hollow eyes staring inside. One of the crew members panicked and tried to flee, but the captain held them back. "Stay together," he shouted. "We finish this now." Elena continued, her voice growing louder, matching the intensity of the spirits. The lights flickered, and the pressure inside the submarine spiked dangerously. The spirits lashed out, their spectral forms trying to breach the submarine. With a final, desperate effort, Elena completed the ritual. The spirits let out a collective wail before vanishing into the depths. The submarine lurched, then stilled. The whispers ceased. The crew sat in stunned silence as the realization sank in. They had survived. The submarine systems began to stabilize, and the oppressive weight of the whispers lifted. Elena slumped in her seat, drained but alive. "Is it over?" Martinez asked, his voice barely audible. For now, Elena replied, though a lingering sense of unease remained. They navigated carefully out of the trench, the ruins of the sunken city fading into the darkness below. The loss of several crew members weighed heavily on them, but those who remained were determined to return to the surface. As they ascended, the water grew lighter, the oppressive darkness giving way to the familiar blue of the ocean. Relief washed over them as they reached safer depths. Just as the submarine neared the surface, a faint, familiar sound crackled through the comms, a single whisper. "Return." Elena stared at the speaker, her heart sinking. The sea never forgets,